Senator Wagner, let's start out. What is the sticking point we're at right now? What is the sticking point?
The sticking point for the walkout right now is what the... Well, I think right now we're here doing the work. So our members are here, we're passing budgets, we're talking about policy that's impacting the legislative session. And we've got an open door. One thing I said at the beginning of this legislative session was there's always an open door, there's always room for kindness in this process, and good ideas come from everywhere. So one thing that we're really hoping is that we honestly see a real list of proposals from the Republicans, and we really haven't seen one yet.
Former Senate leaders Courtney and Bart Sugar, they were telling me they would speak on the phone several times a day during the walkouts to try and hammer out a deal. Is that happening with Senator Knope at all?
Yeah, since the start of the legislative session, we've kept a very open door, trying to be as cordial as we possibly can. Every week we have a standing meeting, and unfortunately, for the last several weeks, Senator Knope has canceled out on those. But we have other people that are talking, and you saw the governor engaged. We have multiple opportunities, and hopefully we can get those talks started again.
There's been some discussion of a suggestion to get everybody in a room. Get everybody and not let them leave until a deal is done. That's been done in the past.
Yeah.
Is that something you considered?
Yeah, I think it's worthy. Now, two things. One, I started my legislative service in 2018, so pretty much what I've known is walkouts. In 2019, I think the person you talked about getting everybody in a room, watched everybody walk out even when there were people in the room, and then they walked out again, and then they walked out again in 2020. So there wasn't a lot of getting people in the room. There was just people shutting down government. I'm totally open to trying to get everybody in the room. In fact, with our office here, we worked on getting the speaker, the majority leaders, both minority leaders together. And we met for several days. And at the end of about 12 hours of negotiation, we were presented with a kill list. And ultimately, that was something that we really, in order to have honest negotiation, you need to know the terms of the debate. And we haven't really been presented with that yet.
Why not take the contentious issues you have now, table them for a later time, and then just deal with everything else you have?
Well, I think it's important to know that the voters vote on policies that they think are really, really important. So for example, we started the legislative session with broadly bipartisan support. We got housing done, a giant jobs and semiconductor package, and the bills that are lined up for consideration on the floor are broadly bipartisan. Over 90% of the bills we pass out of here. But sometimes it means that you have difficult conversation in a democracy about things that you don't necessarily want to vote on. But it's important. If you're going to get paid to show up to do the work, you need to be able to have those tough debates out in the open. And that's all we're asking people to do, is to have that debate out in the open.
Contentious issues appear to be, at this point, abortion, gender-affirming care, OHA, CDC, both say abortions for girls under the age of 15, extremely rare. We're talking about 1% at this time. If the Republicans came to you and said, hey, let's compromise and put each case in front of a judge, is that something you would agree to?
Well, again, we haven't seen a formal proposal. We keep talking about whether or not that's something that they're actually asking for. I will say this. Since the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, Oregon voters are very, very clear that we are a pro-choice state and that we want to protect access to legal abortion for women across the state. That's what this legislation that is before the legislature right now does, is it codifies Roe in Oregon statute. And that's why I think it's really important that people don't lose sight of that.
If they came to you with that compromise, is that something you feel you could get the group behind?
Well, I think it's open for conversation. I think it's really important that we don't lose any legal protections right now for people as it relates to access to abortion services. So if you're talking about stripping the right for anyone in the state under the current law to lose access to reproductive freedom, I don't think you're going to find a lot of people in the general public or in this building that want to go there.
What about taking the sticking point issues and putting up the vote of the people?
Yeah,
Has that been considered?
Well, I guess I would, again, come back to what are the sticking point issues. Maybe in your conversations you can get a full list of what people are actually asking for. That's been done before, where you've seen things either referred out or that people have had opportunities. We do have the initiative and referendum process in the state of Oregon, and it gets used rather frequently, where people, if they have an objection to something that we do, they can collect signatures to try to overturn it. But I do think it's important that we are elected representatives of our communities, and I'm very proud of that. So the fact that we have debate that's transparent, that's nuanced, that's out in the open, I think we play an important role. So not everything just needs to go to the voters.
How is this affecting you personally? I mean, do you lose sleep at night? I mean, knowing that this major stoppage is going on right now, you have a leadership role in it, and it's ground to a halt. Do you lose sleep at night?
Yeah, well, as we were talking about earlier, I've spent over half of my life in and around the Oregon State legislative process. So I remember what it was like to be a legislative staffer when I was working for a Democrat in the minority, who, by the way, didn't walk out. And then also as an advocate, and then being in around this building. Sometimes policymaking on behalf of the public is hard. So I take the long view on it, and I couldn't be more proud to be continuing to have the opportunity to do this job.
Is it kind of get to your head though? I mean, after a while, I would think, because this is your first stoppage in this position. After a while, this kind of go, my gosh, this is just overwhelming.
Well, if you look, I think there's kind of a national conversation that's happening here around extremist movements in legislatures. So if you take both a national perspective, but also just a historical perspective, what we get to work on down here on behalf of the public, it's an incredible honor, and I wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
Who's to blame for this walkout, would you say?
Well, I think, blame is a tough word, but I think it's really clear when you look at what the Constitution says. And the Constitution says that when you're elected, you need to come down here and have robust debate on issues that impact the lives of Oregonians, budgets and bills on healthcare and housing and reproductive freedom. Those are the kinds of things that we're elected to come down here and do. And this continual push for people who want to get paid to walk off the job, I think it's distressing.
Do you think they should be paid?
No, in fact, right now, the entire Senate, for the second day in a row, has decided to assess fines that are equivalent to the amount of money that the folks that are holding up the legislature would be getting paid. We hear from people across the state that if they don't show up to work and they want to protest, they're not going to get paid.
You listen to the Republicans, they'll say they should get paid because they're doing what their constituents want them to do, and that's their job.
Yeah, I just fundamentally disagree. Yeah, I think ultimately, if you ask the voters too, Measure 113 passed this last fall, which establishes, with over 68% of the vote, it passed in every single state Senate district across the state of Oregon. And that one says that if you don't show up to work, if you have 10 unexcused absences, you lose your job. I think it's pretty clear that voters don't want people getting paid if they don't show up to work.
Media across this country are talking about Oregon right now in this walkout. Is that an embarrassment for this state right now?
Well, I think it's indicative of potentially where we are as a country, but I also think that there's the potential for us to walk out of here in a really good place. We still have several weeks to go in our session. I'm hoping that people lean into the civility and what makes Oregon special, and that is staying here, having debate, showing up, talking about the tough stuff, and ultimately voting on the floor.
A lot of people, though, you talk to them on the streets, and they just see the two sides going at it, and they think, we've just got to get something resolved here, and that's the concern of the people, and I'm sure you hear that as well.
Yeah, I think, it doesn't help when there's name calling and things like that, but to me, I just look at the issues that impact families across the state. So if you focus on the issues, I think it's easier to come to terms with the fact that, sometimes there's just tough conversations that happen in politics.
Nobody likes walkouts, of course. Measure 113 didn't work. The fines have not worked at this point, so what is next?
Well, I think it's too early to say necessarily that Measure 113 didn't work. I do think that you have a group of folks that aren't going to be able to file to run for re-election this year. They've made that decision to walk off the job knowing full well what the consequences that the voters put in place were. So I think, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for these things to kind of work themselves out. I do think the next step, though, is that there are folks that want to see really good things happen for their communities with bills and budgets on education and housing and human services and transportation infrastructure. Those are the things that are before the legislature, and those are the things we need to be focusing on.
Do you see a deal being made here? What's your vision here? Do you realistically see it happening?
Yeah, I think there's the potential that that's really going to be where we end up, and I'm hopeful. I think the door is continually open. There's still conversations that are happening.
Is it better today than it was yesterday, do you think?
I think so. But, I'm a glasses half full kind of person, so there you go.
Is it more important, do you think, to stand firm or compromise?
Well, it depends on what you mean by compromise. So I can't compromise on our democracy. I can't compromise what it means that a minority position that only wants to come in and vote on the things that they want to vote on, and then they want to shut down government. And that's what we've seen over and over again. It's this idea that if you don't get your way, that you're going to take the ball and walk off the court. I think voters are done with that. So if you're talking about compromise, it means that absolutely, we've had an open door since day one. We are talking about bills and budgets that impact people's lives across this state. There's tons of room for people to come to the table with a working list to talk about the things that impact our communities together. But if you're just talking about, I'm only going to show up to vote on the things that I want to show up and vote on, I think people have been pretty clear that they're tired of that kind of politics.
What can you say to the viewers out there and the voters who are concerned about what they see and what they see is the gridlock and just the politics that they're tired of? What do you say to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, we all have dinner with family every weekend, and so we get these questions and people that go back to our communities. I think a little bit is that politics can be very difficult. I think that sometimes, especially in our current era, if you look, Oregon, unfortunately, maybe isn't that exceptional for some of the more extremist movements that you see out there. That this can be sort of difficult, but that there's still incredible promise. There's incredible things that the legislature can do on behalf of Oregonians, and we're going to continue to do that work.
Would you say that this stoppage that we have, the fact that we ground to a halt, is indicative of your leadership at all as President of the Senate?
Well, nobody ever wants to be self-reflective, but I will just say that in the 5 years that I've been in the Oregon State Senate, we've seen 5 walkouts, and the last time prior to COVID that we had Republicans in this exact same position with a different presiding officer, they walked out and they shut down government.
Have you thought about reaching out to former Senate President Courtney to say, what would you do, or a little advice along the way?
Yeah, I'm happy to reach out to Peter. In fact, I think Carol's already got us trying to figure out how to sit down at the YMCA and grab a cup of coffee. Great ideas come from everywhere, including former elected officials. And so, Peter obviously has made a really important impact on this state and deserves that respect.